Okay, calm down. You got rivers, man. You got rivers, man. Okay, calm down.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Katie Halper Show. Very, very excited to be here with you. We have a great show for you tonight. It's jam-packed. We are going to be talking to Mike Prysner about a major story that he broke about Ron DeSantis and his kind of secretive military past. But before that, we're going to be talking to the wonderful filmmaker Tami Gold and wonderful organizer Leigh Oshiro-Brantly. They're going to be talking about sex workers' rights and a new documentary that they are working on. But before we start the show, of course, I want to welcome everyone to the show. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks for being here. Please like the stream. It's not only for my ego. Of course, I like when you like the stream. That makes me feel very nice. But it's also for the algorithm. It helps us beat the corporate overlords who try to control us and suppress our streams. So make sure you like the stream. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe. Just hit subscribe and then the bell, so that way you never miss any of these streams. Also, if you can become Patreon supporters, that's of course extremely appreciated. And to do that, you just go to patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. There's the link right below me. For $1 a month, which is just $12 a year, you help make the show happen. For $5 a month, you get tons of bonus content. So we're, of course, very grateful to all of our Patreon supporters. Also, tweet this out and Facebook this out. Let's make sure that people come into this stream because this is going to be a great show. And we're very excited about this. Thank you so much to everyone who came out to the live taping that we did at the People's Forum last week with the wonderful Miko Pellet, who's so great, the author of the book, The General Son. In case you missed it, you can watch it, of course, on YouTube, and you can hear it, of course, on the podcast. Also, please make sure you rate and review the podcast. And Miko Pellet, of course, is the son of a decorated Israeli war general. He was born and raised a proud Zionist. Miko was, so was his father. And then Miko became an advocate for the one-state solution and is very anti-Zionist. And his book is amazing. And I think whenever I talk to him, it's a really fascinating discussion. So thank you so much for people who came out. And also apologies because friend of show Phil Winter told me that he got there like 10 minutes late and it wasn't able to get in. I don't know what happened. I do know that people came late and were coming in and out throughout the night. And I know that because it was raining really hard. And whenever people came in, I would hear the raining outside. So if that happened to you, I'm really, 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 really sorry. Really sorry. And yeah, again, huge apology. If you're just tuning in, we have two different segments on the show. Both are going to be excellent. One is with Mike Prysner, who is from the Empire Files and the Eyes Left podcast. He's an anti-war veteran, and he's going to be talking about a major scoop that he has about Ron DeSantis. But we're also going to be talking to some guests about sex workers and a documentary about sex workers. So I'm going to bring them on in a second. And here, let me just tell you about who they are. Tami Gold is a multidisciplinary artist, cultural worker, and a professor at Hunter College, CUNY. Her teaching focuses on documentary production and LGBTQ nonfiction studies. As a filmmaker, Tami has produced documentaries including Every Mother's Son, Juggling Gender, Politics, Sex, and Identity, Making the Impossible Possible, the story of Puerto Rican studies at Brooklyn College, RFK in the Land of Apartheid, The Last Hunger Strike, Ireland, 1981, among others. She is the recipient of a Rockefeller, Guggenheim, and Fulbright fellowships, and she's won countless awards, including AFI Independent Filmmakers Fellowship and Tribeca Audience Award, among others. We are also bringing onto the virtual stage Leigh Oshiro-Brantly, who is an organizer, sex worker, and survivor who does advocacy and research around disabilities, poverty, food, housing, instability, and violence. They have co-authored academic papers, conducted interviews and focus groups, done community organizing, and made documentaries, and served at organizations like the Ishtar Collective, GLITZ, SOAR Institute, Decriminalize Sex Work, and New York Transgender Advocacy Group. They were an advisor for the Museum of the City of New York's Transgender Activism exhibit and received the 2019 Marsha P. Johnson Community Leader Award from New York Transgender Advocacy Group, where they have served as the president of the New York State Gender Diversity Coalition since 2019. So, without any further ado, let us bring into the chat Tami and Leigh. Hello.
Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for joining. Hi, welcome.
Very excited and happy to be here.
Thank you. So I want to know how you two met and how this film that you're both working on, Tammy, you're producing it, Leigh, you're a consultant. How did this project start?
Well, there's two different um, questions. One is how Jay Lee and I met, and why don't we start there? Because we're both here, and I think it's important that those of us who are filmmakers, we often are also activists. And in doing a film, it's not me doing a film in isolation. And so I met Jay Lee in the work that they do, the work within organizing, within bringing visibility and both not just visibility but ideology to the struggle to decriminalize sex work. So we met recently, and I was really impressed, not just with the spirit that Jay Lee, you're here, so I don't want to talk about like you're not here, but your spirit, your commitment, and the fact that you are really a visionary. And I realized that really early on when I first saw a lot of the events that you were hosting and doing during COVID. So that was my introduction, really meeting Jay Lee in a virtual world. And then finally meeting Jay Lee, meeting you when you were presenting a film that you were one of the producers of. So that's that's how we came together. In terms of the question of decriminalizing sex work, my introduction to that was from the book The End of Policing by Alex Vitale. And
Friend of the
Alex
show.
and
He's been
I,
on a bunch.
yeah, he's been on the show, and he and I are colleagues. And when he first had the manuscript for the book, even before it was published, I met with him and said, wow, the end of policing. I mean, that is the essence of what I struggle for. The end of the carceral state, the end of how we understand the militarization of our cities by the police. So we decided to produce something together, and there was a lot of process in that. And then the chapter in his book about decriminalizing sex work really jumped out as a way to talk about policing, police brutality, the system that we have that's driven by white supremacy, transphobia, homophobia, that over polices communities that are some of the most marginal, made to be marginal. So that's where we jumped off, and that's kind of how I started. And I had a lot of learning to do in the process.
Great, thank you. And we're going to talk more about the documentary that you're working on. And Leigh, what about you? How did you get involved in this film and in this issue too?
That's a great question. How we kind of end up collaborating with each other as filmmakers and advocates. Thank you for those kind words, by the way, that were said. I think one can only Google Tammy and then be quite impressed with all the accomplishments and you know um, the awards and these kinds of things. I think you know sometimes when you just kind of focus in on doing your work and have a passion for it, particularly if it has an advocacy bent, whether or not that's the focus, I think you just you end up just doing like prolific work. You just you keep making projects because the deeper you dig into the rabbit hole of injustice, you realize that it's kind of bottomless. And then you go, oh, I was just going to do this project, but now I'm here, and all of a sudden I find myself as an advocate through whatever, maybe filmmaking if you're an artist, um, whatever your medium is. And I think that that's a lot, how I end up collaborating with other artist advocates is that we kind of just started in one thing, and whether it's like housing injustice or food instability or disability justice, or in my case, um, sex worker rights, and then it just becomes very intersectional, right? Because you realize that we don't live our lives in silos, right? There are many ways in which all of these kind of injustices in the world inform each other and sometimes exacerbate each other. And actually, I don't even think Tami knows this. I met Alex this summer in Portugal, in Lisbon, at a conference. I haven't even told Tami that, but that was where I first met him at a reading of the book in Lisbon right after a Law and Society conference I was presenting a paper at, and certainly he was as well. So a bunch of academics, and I definitely did not belong in that setting. Not yet, but maybe one day. They let me sneak in.
Infiltrate. Yeah.
Absolutely. Whores, we're everywhere you want to be.
Oh, that's good. That could be the subtitle to the film. And I didn't mention the film is called It's Just a Job. So Leigh, tell us about how you started out as an organizer or organizing around sex work.
It was really by accident. I had definitely been kind of an advocate for other issues outside of the sex industry, but had been a sex worker myself, weirdly, like not thinking about reform within my industry, which I think is actually really common for a lot of labor folks. We don't think about reforming our own industry. We don't think about the injustices that keep us in different parts of stigmatization or marginalization. We're just there. We're trying to make a dollar. We're trying to work just like anyone else. And I think I really wanted to go into research, and that was my passion. I've been a filmmaker for many years in different capacities, and I wanted to use film as a research methodology for sex workers. That I was super interested in. And as I was trying to find, work to do research in, as like with my crappy little like undergrad degree and like no sort of academic experience doing research, I landed in a whole community of people that were like, do you want to start doing advocacy? We do community-based research in advocacy worlds. So that's where I started.
Great. And this film is about this film follows several sex workers and talks to both sex workers and advocates and some policy people. And you even, shockingly enough, had a prosecutor, which blew me away. You actually had a prosecutor you spoke with, Tami, who opposes prosecuting sex workers, who I guess supports decriminalization, and you speak to some local politicians, also former guests of the show, Ron Kim, for instance. But what can you guys tell us what the goal of decriminalization is and why it's different from legalization?
Well, decrim is to decriminalize a job, to decriminalize every aspect. For example, decriminalizing both the sex worker and the consumer, often called the Johns, that it's full decriminalization, and that there's a lot of different things out there that's called the Nordic model, the end demand model, the entrapment model, and they are where you don't criminalize the sex worker, but you arrest the John. And that creates a whole bunch of problems unto itself. And so in the film, we're trying very much to tease apart things that are sometimes complicated. And this is a complicated one, because if you look at sex work as something negative, you might want to end the demand. But if you look at sex work, consensual sex work among adults, and I emphasize consensual, then we're talking about why do we want to end the demand? It's a job. That's how we got the title, It's Just a Job. And so the difference between why people in the movement are demanding, fighting for, protesting for full decrim, not legalization, is because legalization in a capitalist society, legalization where we have racism, where we have all these isms that are alive and well, if we legalize sex work, there'll be a two-tier system. Just like what's happened in terms of the legalization of marijuana. We have a case study of marijuana and who got impacted by that. The corporations took it over. Small business wiped out. People are still incarcerated. The legalization doesn't guarantee justice. So the idea of taking the criminality in the job away allows people to have equal access in this form of work. Leigh, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really great, overview. I mean, I think, when people say, okay, oh, we want to legalize it, we want to decriminalize it, they're many times using those two words interchangeably. But as Tami said, this does create a two-tiered system, right? Where people who are already at the margins, usually and affected most by policing, by criminalization, by incarceration, those are the folks that suffer under a two-tiered system. You have people of color, you have poor folks, you have trans folks, you have people living with disability, folks that have, prior rap sheets. Like, it's a compounded reality that when you legalize something, you're still making it criminal. The behavior is still criminal. You're just saying, under these circumstances, we won't arrest you. The United States only has one state that has legalized prostitution. Of course, that's Nevada. But a lot of people don't know. They assume that Vegas, of course, is legalized prostitution. It's not. It's outside of Vegas, and Vegas has the highest rates of prostitution arrests in the entire country, and it's right next door. So that's a concrete example of what happens in a place where there's legalization in smaller rural towns. Many times they're monopolies. Many times they are tied into folks that have sort of legacy, stakes in keeping it, criminal. And for some people who are brothel owners, that is the case, because if it were to become decriminalized, then their business goes away, right? You have a control on the market. People, of color, people with various bodies, people of all genders, many times get left out of those systems because they want to homogenize it in a way that's the most palatable. You can think of it as sort of, the Walmartification of an industry, to say like, okay, well, we only want these people working here. We only want it under these. Here's the market. They control the market. They can, and it just affects a lot of smaller business owners and individual business owners, just like Tami said.
It also seems to me, I think a lot of people really love talking about their opinions on sex work and whether they think it's liberating or exploitative. But to me, it's kind of like either way, making it criminalizing it is not good for sex workers. It's almost like I don't really care about people's opinions on it. People sometimes will focus more on sex work as an idea than they do on the lived experiences of sex workers. And it's never going to go away. I mean, you can try to take away the demand, it won't go away. So I just find it really, like, people who are, I get why some people feel conflicted, but to me, I really think that to like oppose decriminalization requires living with your head in the sand, and refusing to look at how you're going to put these people in harm's way.
That's right. That's right.
One of the reasons why we need to talk about stigma, because if you have a job and there's stigma associated to the job, right away there's moral condemnation. And we in the film are really saying that stigma reinforces criminalization, and criminalization reinforces stigma. So if we look at another kind of job, if we look at the horrendous job of working in a company like McDonald's, making very little money, being treated awfully, having to work like on an assembly line, we could stigmatize that job. We don't. We don't stigmatize jobs of people working in the fields, picking tomatoes, with the toxic waste put on them to take care of the bugs in the fields that are hitting the farm workers. That's not stigmatized. So the first thing we have to say is, why is it stigmatized? And the stigma, it's massive. It's massive. The lowest denominator or the lowest element in any humor, in anything, is
Yes.
call somebody either a whore, a hooker, whatever.
Right.
It's about reinforcing stigma. And this goes to sexism, it goes to male supremacy. And the way it plays out in the United States is that there's a hierarchy, and it relates to race, gender, sexual orientation. And that's where some people are on the top and some people are not. And we also have to look at that, because the policing of sex workers who are white, traditionally beautiful, very tall. I've been taken on tours of Wall Street where there are places where the end of the day or the end of the week, there's sex parties in corporate America. And this doesn't surprise any of us. And all the working women are white and Russian.
Mm.
So right away, we have to understand the intersectionality of the criminalization and the stigma. And so it might be good to show some of the
Yeah,
images.
Brad, let's show some of these. I mean, stigma is around today, but let's show some of these posters that you feature in the documentary. So this is She May Look Clean, but pickups, good time girls, prostitutes, spread syphilis and gonorrhea. You can't beat the Axis if you got VD. So this was a wartime poster, obviously. VD is venereal disease, by the way. What STIs used to be called before they were called STDs, before that, venereal disease. This is a sign that says smash the prostitution racket, prostitutes spread venereal disease. And then this is a sign, men who know say no to prostitutes, spreaders of syphilis and gonorrhea.
These are put out by the US government. These were put out. And we have to remember the role of our government, the role in terms of being a government that promotes war. And yes, it was the Second World War where those posters come from, but it's the same thing. It's like creating a judgment, a stigma, the negativity. These gentle women, they look good on the outside, they're evil on the inside. So it's an extension of, hating women. And all women, cis, trans, there's a hate of women. And one of the things that I've really learned about is the experience that women, trans women, almost 95% trans women of color, experienced by the police, law enforcement. And I don't know, Leigh, do you want to talk a little about the struggle around walking while trans?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think before that, I just wanted to address something that's previously said. I do think that there is stigma from working at McDonald's. I want to say that. Like, I just think it's a different kind of stigma.
It's like a
So I
class
just,
stigma.
yes, right. And so we find ways to bifurcate all the time as people and to say this and that. And I think that it's a different type of
Right.
stigma. But there is this kind of idea that even though a person is engaging in this type of labor, there's some kind of working class honor to it, right?
Right. Yeah.
This idea of you're
Exactly.
working your way, you're working the system, maybe
It's an honest job.
it's an honest job, exactly. And so the stigmatization is there, but it's in a different way. When you have a moral judgment upon something, giving it validity in the culture, like some kind of sort of heroic hero worship to be poor and struggling, then people are more likely to have sort of, oh, well, work hard and you'll climb the corporate ladder. We don't have that, right? Our
Right.
industry, if you have someone who is pulling in six figures a year as a sex worker, they will not have the same respect typically in those circles that a person who is probably working at McDonald's and pulling in 20 to 30,000, right? So that's an interesting, I think, a really interesting lens to view it through, this idea of economics, because in any other industry where you would have an overwhelmingly feminized body or woman making 6 figures, 7 figures, some folks I know as well, and doing so well and owning their own businesses and having the independence and starting their own nonprofit organizations, you know, helping others in their industry. In any other place, you would be like, that's amazing, you go girl, right?
Yeah.
That would be
Yeah.
the perspective. But we do not extend the same reality to folks that are in the sex industry. It's like, oh, no, you can become a millionaire, just don't do it this way, you can't
Yeah.
do it that way. So I just wanted to touch on that briefly. I think,
Thank you.
oh yeah, no, I mean, it's a different type of stigma, and you know, that's, you know, you mentioned the you know, hierarchy in our world, we call it the hierarchy, right? This idea that there's, you know, even within our sort of marginalized groups, we bifurcate ourselves as well and say, oh, well, I'm doing this type, you know, the proliferation of OnlyFans is a concrete example of this. Well, I'm only doing content, I'm only taking pictures, right? And so this idea of like destigmatizing what is essentially pornography for, you know, the Midwest housewife that needed to make some money during the pandemic, that's fine. But folks who've been doing this as a living, you know, who are on a different website, who are maybe, you know, doing different types of content or have a different body than what was mentioned earlier, that is, you know, looked upon as much more privileged. Those are the types of stigma that we create within the hierarchy of sex work in and of itself. And that also has to stop, because, you know, sex is sex, work is work. You know what I mean? And they need to just be exactly what they are. Sex can be sexy. Sex can be boring. Sex can be powerful. Sex can be bad. Sex can be fulfilling. Sex can be monetizing. It is just a thing. It has whatever value we put onto it. The people engaged in it. Sex without consent is rape, right? But it's still a sexual activity. So it is really important as we're doing this destigmatizing work that we don't give a word of value that it does not have. Sex just is a thing, and it's up to us to place that value upon it, depending on how we do it, with what agency, with what power, with what resources, and those people coming together that are having it. So I just, you know, work is the same way. Work is just work, you know? It can be empowering, can be amazing. But to bring back the point about the walking while trans aspects, you know, in New York State, we had something on the books for many years up until 2021. We didn't even pass this law. It was loitering for the purposes of prostitution, colloquially termed walking while trans, because the overwhelming amount of people who were policed by this were Black and brown trans women, and overwhelmingly in one large neighborhood and the neighboring neighborhood in New York, Queens and Brooklyn. And so this was a highly profiling law that was used overwhelmingly to target trans women of color, especially those that were migrant workers. ICE was heavily involved, usually in the whole, you know, the entire aspect from, you know, vice raids to you know, trafficking, being there in the anti-trafficking courts when folks were let out. So excuse me, ICE is what I was talking about. So it was really targeted against a lot of migrant women, and cisgendered Black and brown women as well, but overwhelmingly trans women of color.
And what is the status of that?
We repealed it finally in 2021. And I will tell you this: we had the votes to take it to the floor in June of 2020. During the uprising, the racial reckoning, and the current majority leader refused to do it because it wasn't politically expedient. So she thought it would be better for you know, people to continue being arrested during the height of the pandemic for another 8 to 9 months, rather than, you know, it to be, you know, repealed immediately. I mean, we had like 70-something% of the votes in June, and it wasn't until I think January that it finally went forward.
2021.
2021. Yeah.
I think it was January 2nd. I don't know, but I think it was pretty close to the new year. It was a
Oh
very,
yeah, it was definitely after the new year, for sure, for
it
sure.
was exciting. I
Almost
mean,
done. So.
I think so much struggle led by trans women of color brought that victory. And, when I show the rough cut of the film to people, I haven't shown it to many people, but the advisors and my family have seen it.
It's really good. I've seen it.
They always say, why are trans women the leaders? And we have to answer that, and we don't do it yet. That's a big issue that we have to bring up and highlight. I ask the question, why? It's the leadership of the decriminalization, decrim movement is coming from trans women of color. And I mean, we have to say it. That is the leaders who led this thing to end the walking while trans ban. And the thing about it is, an injustice to one is an injustice to all. So by getting rid of that statute, what we've also been able to do is make it easier without this. It's not just walking while trans. What this means is a police officer can no longer stop someone and arrest them because they think they're soliciting with the purpose of prostitution. They cannot do that. Cis, trans, white, people of color, men, gay, it can no longer be done. So the leadership from the trans community is what gave a victory to all of us. And we need to really point that and bring that home in the film. What do you think, Jaylee?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, why is that significant? Trans women of color are a very small percentage of the population. Very small. They're a small percentage of the LGBTQ population, but they are overwhelmingly targeted by police. The arrest rates are astronomical. They're grotesquely disproportionate, not just arrests, but also prosecutions as well. So the point of it is, these are the people that are most affected by policing and the criminality of prostitution. And so when you think about it in terms of that, here's our folks that are being arrested the most. They're being arrested over and over and over again. So if they even wanted to leave the sex industry, you're making it impossible for them to do so if they ever desire to do that, because you basically put them in the system and keep them in the system. And with things like the loitering for the purposes of prostitution, it's literally a law that was created to punish people who possibly look like they were a prostitute. Can you imagine? This is stop and frisk.
Right.
That's exactly what it is. So it's just like, you look like a whore. You look like a whore. So we are going to stop and arrest you, and that's going to go on your record. And there are loitering for the purposes of prostitution country, all across the United States. We keep trying to strike them down. But then those arrest records are on, folks' rap sheet for the rest of their lives, including, by the way, people who were trafficked into sex work.
Right.
Who were forced into sex work will have these arrests still on their record, which is one of the reasons why we always are trying to fight for vacatur of those convictions for survivors of trafficking. And it's extremely important that we understand the difference between trafficking and consensual work, because if you don't understand that, you will get everything wrong on top of it.
Yeah. And in fact, I think a lot of people, including people in the chat, they're saying that they've seen people trafficked, and there's a lot of police rape and of sex workers. And I think for some people, that's a reason to make it illegal. But given those two things, to me, that's just an argument for we should be separating those things. We should be separating it, because
Absolutely.
Trafficking is something that is against one's consent. And in fact, we know, I mean, you guys can talk about this more than I can, but how when you push things into the underbelly of society, like when they made that the Rent Boy illegal, or they've made other websites illegal because they want to shut down trafficking, they say, what happens is that people are much more vulnerable, and all these systems that were created so that people can warn other people about certain bad actors those no longer exist. And all you're doing is like you're creating a non-consensual situations.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And I will ask the audience that has any skepticism around this idea of what happens when we criminalize something. Um, just look at where we're at right now. We're in post Roe v. Wade, where abortions are now illegal across this United States. Does that make
Mhm.
people safer? Has that made people more or less vulnerable? Has it made it more difficult for them to get their health care? Has it stigmatized them? This is a concrete, real life example of
Mhm.
what happens when you criminalize something that is a public
Mhm.
health reality, that is a human right. It is a human right for bodily autonomy to do what you want to do with your body. As long as you are not hurting another person who is an adult, you have the right to do whatever you want to do with your body. It is
Mhm.
yours. It's the same way with sex work. If you are not hurting someone, if you are not coercing them into sex work, and by the way, for those of us who are anti-trafficking, warriors like myself, the only way to fight trafficking in the sex industry is to decriminalize it. Because every time you criminalize something further, you make it harder for folks to come out of exploitative situations. That's why the
Mhm.
World Health Organization, Amnesty International, like multiple organizations in the United Nations all recommend the full decriminalization of adult consensual sex work.
And
Right.
we emphasize this is adult consensual sex work, totally different from sex trafficking. So I don't know what people are saying in terms of the chat, but the the correlation is so big. The speaking about this, the nonprofits that soak up so much of the economic resources to dominate the discourse on that all sex work is trafficked, that you have to end sex work by ending the demand, and that there's a way to stop sex work by criminalizing the entire field. Sex trafficking is not consensual sex work. And it's important that we make this demarcation. And one of the things in the film is the prosecutor says that when you penalize anything, it goes underground. Just
Right.
like what Jay Lee was saying about abortions. You could make them illegal. They're not going to stop. They're going to become more dangerous. They're going to go underground. And that is a lot of how we have to understand the question of the distinction between consensual and trafficked, and then the need to be able to recognize if there's criminalization, those who are trafficked cannot come out to police because then they would be criminalizing themselves because sex
Right.
work is criminal. So you see, it's this kind of interesting um, layered contradictions. But the film is trying very hard to make the point absolutely consensual sex work is consensual sex work among adults.
Right.
Period. Exchange of money.
Someone wrote in the comments, you can't support decarceration and then turn around and oppose the decriminalization of sex work. Those positions are irreconcilable, which I think is spot on.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you have any, you've been so generous with your time and we've actually gone over, but because this is such a great discussion, is there anything else you want to make sure that we touch on?
I would love to just plug. This weekend was a pretty historic
Yeah.
weekend for a variety of reasons. One, was a very hard for many of us. Carol Lee, aka the Scarlet Harlot, the person who coined the term sex worker. She passed away late last week, and it was a really hard thing for many of us because she's been such a huge figure in the movement. But it was also incredibly powerful timing because this weekend myself and many other organizers in New England, we put together the first ever New England Sex Work Summit in Manchester, New Hampshire, which is surprising for many people that it's not like in a big city, but the greatest movement towards decriminalization in this country right now is actually in New England, in places like Vermont, New Hampshire, Rhode Island. These are the places that are having the most movement forward in state legislatures around decriminalization efforts. So yeah, if my organization is called the Ishtar Collective, for anyone who would like to, support us, we're a nonprofit as well, and we're Vermont's only sex worker led and really only sex worker organization. We also support survivors of trafficking as well. So if you want to donate, please check us out, ishtarcollective.org. We have a farm. And hookers be growing some food up there. So, one of the things that's important for us as we do these fights to make sure that this industry is safer and more equitable is that I can't fight for the right of myself and all of my fellow sex workers to do our work in a decriminalized environment. If I can't also fight for the right of Black trans women not to do this work if they don't want to,
Right.
right?
That's
Because
really
if we
important
don't
point.
create economic opportunities for people to do whatever they want to do in this world, whether it's become president or an engineer or whatever the case it may be, then that's societal coercion in my viewpoint. So I'm also fighting for my trans siblings to be able to have access to every single economic opportunity they have, labor opportunity that they want. And that's how we do, this kind of intersectional work.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was hard. I didn't know Carol Lee was sick. I was shocked when I read it.
Yeah. An amazing human that's been doing this work since, 70s, 80s. Yeah.
Yeah. So I hope your audience stays tuned to the release of the film.
Yeah. When do you think it's going to be released?
Oh God. When hopefully like mid 2023,
Great.
the issue of independent filmmaking and what I also called passionate and passion filmmaking is that we don't have money. And so it's always fundraising. So I'm at that point right now to fundraise, but then also to understand that it's urgent that this film get out. It's urgent that this discussion open up and that we challenge people who don't get it and that we have a tool in our hands and that this film, a study guide that will go with the film, a way to have sections of the film so it could be very short in parts so that it's not just committed to people who have the time to sit down and watch 70 minutes. We know it's important to do that. We need to do it as soon as possible. And so that's why I'm in a hurry. I feel like I'm on a treadmill, running. So I'd say mid 2023.
Okay, great. Yeah, we should have you guys back on because I would love, there's so many comments in the chat that I would actually want you to respond to. So let's do this again because I think there's so many things that people still struggle to wrap their heads around. And I think people need to be, I see some people in the chat that are saying, in my opinion, things that are almost like just counter illogical, like saying that it needs to be illegal because there's a lot of rape in sex work. It's like, that's exactly why it needs to be decriminalized. Like, how do you think you're making people safer if it's an illegal industry?
Why do you think that sex workers and people across the board that are over policed, like any feminized body, any woman, why do they not go to the police?
Right.
When they are assaulted? Just ask yourself that question. When you have all these barriers, they're not going to be believed. What were you wearing is the question. Did you bring this? Re-traumatizing a survivor, putting criminality between them and justice is insane. Please check your facts, people, and start looking through the lens of public health rather than your own limited morality around this issue.
It's about morality. And I don't know where that listener or that viewer comes up with the idea that most sex workers are raped in their job.
Absolutely. I've been a sex worker for full-time 12 years. I have never been sexually assaulted in sex work, ever.
And you're also a survivor, right?
I'm a survivor, yes, of labor exploitation outside of the sex industry.
Right.
I'm a survivor of sexual assault outside of the sex industry. Both of them were in my publicity company job in my previous life. So let's have real conversations, right? You want to stigmatize sex work? Many of us have never experienced injustice or sexual assault in those situations, but we sure as hell did when we were bartending. So let's have some real conversations.
Yeah. And I'm certainly a survivor of sexual violence against me. And I've never been a sex worker. And I was raped as a teenager. I was not a sex worker. And I was violently raped. So let's really look into this and not come up with percentages if we don't really study this and really speak to sex workers.
Yeah.
Sex workers must be part of this discussion, and they must be at the table.
Well, thank you guys so much. That was such a great thing to end on. Great note to end on. I think you both made such important points.
Thank you so
And
much
would love
for
to have
having me.
you
Would
back.
love to have you back. Thank you. I was going to say I would love to be back if you invited us
yeah.
again. Thank you so much.
And next time you'll come back with your camera on.
Yeah.
I will.
Great.
I'll say hello to everybody out there. Appreciate
And we're gonna sign off by we don't go anywhere because we have Mike Prysner coming on. But while we Brad, why don't we play Tammy's clip from Every Mother's Son, because we can't play a trailer from It's Another Job for legal reasons. But we're gonna play this trailer from another documentary that Tammy did, and then after the trailer, we'll be joined by Mike Prysner, who's going to talk about this major scoop, this major story that he broke about Ron DeSantis.
Good. Okay. Another film about aggressive policing.
The night that Anthony was killed, our city suffered a great loss, and it had to do with public trust of the people that we've empowered to protect and serve us. Since then, this family has worked day and night to restore that public trust.
Proud of my son. I know that he wants justice, and for me to continue to get justice for other families.
At the end of the 1990s, a decade in which many American cities adopted aggressive law enforcement strategies, a new civil rights movement started to gain public attention. Born in communities across the United States, it was made up of families whose loved ones had been killed by police officers.
I learned that my son was killed in the vestibule of his apartment by 4 police officers, and that they shot at him 41 times.
Our heart has been broken for the rest of our life. But we want to be among those who want to make change.
I was watching the 10 o'clock news, and they announced that there was a Gideon Bosch that was killed in Borough Park in a hail of bullets. I must have screamed on the top of my lungs. I called the precinct and I was hysterical crying, and I begged them, please tell me. I hope we can learn something from this terrible tragedy and and that somewhere there will be justice and that there will be changes.
This is the story of a group of mothers in New York City whose sons were killed by police officers and who have turned their personal tragedy into an opportunity for change.
And that is from Tammy's other film, Every Mother's Son, and that was made in 2004, and it's also great. So we're going to bring on our next guest, Mike Prysner, who joined the Army 3 months before the 9/11 attacks, and in March 2003 was part of the invasion of Iraq. After 12 months in the occupation, he became an outspoken opponent of the war and became known for speeches, protests, and veterans organizing against U.S. imperialism. Since 2015, he has been the producer and co-writer for Abby Martin's show, The Empire Files, and he is also the host of Eyes Left, a socialist anti-war military podcast. And everyone, like this stream right now. If you haven't liked it, give a thumbs up, because this show deserves it, but also those guests deserve it, and Mike Prysner really deserves it. So thumbs up, everyone. Okay, let's bring him on. Hi, Mike.
Hey. Hi.
How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for joining.
My pleasure.
So you broke a major story, and before you get into the story, which is about Ron DeSantis, I was wondering, because I listened to your podcast about it, how did you even stumble onto this in the first place? Like, what made you think of looking into his military past?
He had an ad for his gubernatorial reelection campaign where he is an Air Force pilot. It's called Top Gov, and
Play it, actually, yeah.
Sure. So I saw that, and it was funny to me because I knew that he wasn't in the Air Force and was not a pilot, but that he did have some military background. And so I decided to look into that and to see what it was. And the thing that piqued my interest in the story was, he I think is still in the military, but he has a military past. He had been in the military since 2004. And the thing that stuck out to me was, we know that he did a tour in Guantanamo Bay. And when he ran for governor in 2018, there was a lot of Florida media in particular that was trying to find out what he did at Guantanamo Bay. It was as part of, he had only alluded to it. He said, I was served at Gitmo, but that's all he ever said. Nobody knows what he did there. So when I found all these stories from Florida press for his 2018 campaign, all they did was basically take at face value what the Navy and what other officers had said. And so all that you would find in the media was that Ron DeSantis, as a JAG lawyer, which is the military's legal system, was there to ensure, quote, the human rights of detainees are respected and that the U.S. was operating within the boundaries of international law. And there's also interviews with fellow officers who worked in the Guantanamo and superiors who said that was his job, was to ensure the human rights of detainees and ensure that international law was being followed. And that's all there was. It wasn't questioned. It was just printed as, this is what Ron DeSantis did at Guantanamo Bay. Anyone who knows anything about Guantanamo Bay knows that 2006, the year that Ron DeSantis was there as the human rights lawyer, was the height of the Bush torture program. And the entire world was looking at Guantanamo Bay. The United Nations was calling for it to be shut down. In 2006, that same year, the United Nations Human Rights Board met and said it was in complete violation of international law for indefinite detention, torture, and all of this. And so that's what made me want to look into it, is knowing that he was there, but the only answer to what he was doing was something that just could not be true.
Okay, so let's take a look at this video. Trigger warning, it's an awful video that obviously, because it's Ron DeSantis, and then we'll get into your investigation.
Sure.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is your governor speaking. Today's training evolution, dogfighting, taking on the corporate media. The rules of engagement are as follows. Number 1, don't fire unless fired upon, but when they fire, you fire back with overwhelming force. Does it say that in the bill? I'm asking you to tell me what's in the bill. Number 2, never ever back down from a fight.
question.
If I could complete the question, though.
So you're going to give a speech or ask a question?
Number 3, don't accept their narrative.
It's wrong. It's a fake narrative. I just disabused you of the narrative, and you don't care about the facts.
It's why people don't trust people like you, because you peddle false narratives. All right, ladies and gentlemen.
Let's jump on.
Oof. So tell us what you found, since that is fiction. What was the truth?
Yeah, well, the first couple years of DeSantis's career in the Navy are pretty boring. He did stuff like in charge of urinalysis, meaning that the peeing in a cup and drug testing of other sailors. So there's nothing really interesting about his first 2 years. But what's interesting is that in 2006, he gets this big break. He goes from doing, physical training scheduling to being sent to Guantanamo Bay in March 2006 at a very particular time and for a very particular purpose. Ron DeSantis went, and it's true that was what his former superiors and military records said, was that officially his job was to ensure the human rights of detainees. That's, of course, what it was on paper. The interesting thing is that was not a job that had already existed, that he was just rotating into as a young officer. That's something that he went to go do, and no one at Guantanamo had seen a human rights lawyer come in and say, I'm here to ensure that your human rights are being protected. What was happening at the time was throughout 2005 and early in 2006, conditions at Guantanamo were so horrific. And of course, to remind people, most of the people at Guantanamo had never committed a crime. I mean, they were just people sold to the CIA, kidnapped by warlords in Afghanistan and Taliban, said, oh, these guys are Al-Qaeda, even though they were just political opponents or just random teenagers that they found, kidnapped them, sold them to the CIA, and then they got sent to Guantanamo. So the majority had never committed a crime, and they're subjected to just horrific torture and treatment every second of every day. And of course, all believed that they were never going to leave. And that was the intent of the United States. They were never going to let any of those people leave. So hundreds of prisoners were taking part in a hunger strike throughout 2005. The US government viewed this hunger strike as a massive threat because they were already in a kind of international and national scandal regarding torture at Guantanamo Bay. In fact, remember the 2007-2008 election, Obama rose to the top as the only one who was saying they're going to close Guantanamo Bay, and then won on that program as well. And so torture and the conditions at Guantanamo and its violation of international law was a big story that a lot of people cared about. The hunger strike was making it much harder for the administrators of Guantanamo. It kept it in the international spotlight. It allowed their plight to become a national and international crisis. And so a group of officers were brought in to Guantanamo to break the hunger strike. A new general and people whose job specifically was, we're going to smash this hunger strike and we're going to break any and all resistance by the detainees that they're taking part in. It seems that Ron DeSantis was part of that crop of people brought into Guantanamo to break the hunger strikers. And so while officially his job was to hear the demands of the detainees and tell them, I'm here to ensure your human rights are being respected. Well, that was officially what his job. What a man I interviewed named Mansour Adayfi, who was there from 2002 to 2016, he said when DeSantis got there, everyone was like, oh, our protest is working. Like, now we have this attorney whose job it is human rights, and we can negotiate with him and we can tell him what the issues are, and we can maybe get some kind of resolution. Things like sleep deprivation and desecration of the Quran, things that are war crimes that they wanted to stop. He said that in actuality what happened, Ron DeSantis was basically playing good cop, talked to detainees about what was hurting them the most and impacting them the most. And then the prison administration multiplied, magnified, increased each one of those things that they complained about. So the intent was to maximize the impact of the torture. And that was the role that Ron DeSantis was playing. He also not only was he playing this kind of good cop role where he'd meet with people and be like, yeah, I'm on your side, and then go tell the prison administrators, hey, do more sleep deprivation because that's really hurting them. He was also present for beatings, for torture, and in particular, force feedings. The tactic to break the hunger strikers ultimately came down to force feeding, which is a really gruesome tactic. I mean, someone is tied to a chair, their head's tied down in every possible point. They use a rubber tube up their nose, but they brought in like really thick tubes to put through their nasal cavity, have like a metal point at the end, so it's extremely painful. And then they basically like fill them completely full with Ensure like diet drinks. They say that there's laxatives in there so that people, while they're being force fed, they're defecating on themselves, they're vomiting. And the person I interviewed, Mansour, said while he was being force fed, while he was defecating himself, vomiting, screaming, and pleading for help, he looks to Ron DeSantis, and the human rights lawyer, and says, "You have to help me. Like, look what they're doing." And his response from DeSantis was smiling, was laughter, and telling Mansour, maybe you should eat then. Maybe you shouldn't be hunger striking if you don't like this. So, I mean, that's the essence of the story. And I think there's some implications for what he did in Iraq. And there's a lot more about his time at Guantanamo, I think, that needs to be investigated. But previous to that, nothing had been known. All that had been known about his time at Guantanamo was he was the lawyer ensuring the rights of detainees, when in fact he was doing very much the opposite.
And how did you go about investigating this?
I found someone who was there at the time, who's now released. Mansour was released
Who's
in
an amazing
2016
person.
because he hadn't done anything, and he's an outspoken person on the issue of closing Guantanamo. And so, yeah, I mean, I knew that I had to hear it from someone firsthand, and he definitely had a firsthand experience.
Yeah. And then you spoke to someone else, right, who was in Iraq. Can you talk about that?
So, yes. One other thing that I think is important about Guantanamo is that there is other incident that happened that Ron DeSantis was present for that I think needs to be investigated more. And that was the very likely murder of 3 protest leaders at the camp. So in June 2006, which, DeSantis was there for March 2006 until January 2007. So he was definitely there. There was a prison uprising. There was like a riot. They were getting ready to start the hunger strike again. I mean, the force feeding that DeSantis was part of broke the hunger strike in about 5 days, because if you're being force fed like that 5 times a day, anyone will give up. I mean, no one can withstand unlimited torture. So in June 2006, things were starting up again. The hunger strike was starting again. There was huge uprisings in the prison, and 3 of the protest leaders were found each in their respective cell with their hands and feet bound together, severely beaten, hanging by their necks, and with large pieces of cloth stuffed down their throats. The Navy did an autopsy and said they all committed suicide in some kind of suicide pact to get back at the U.S., to hurt the United States and do jihad against the United States. No one could do another autopsy because they sent the bodies home with no organs and parts of their throat removed. But it wasn't until 2015 that a book by Staff Sergeant Joseph Hickman, who was a guard at Guantanamo Bay, who was part of putting down that prison uprising, says that those people were definitely tortured to death and to set an example. And that further Freedom of Information Act documents in 2017 kind of corroborated the fact that the suicides is highly unlikely. So that's another highly suspicious incident.
Right. And
that
how
we
could,
know
I mean,
DeSantis was there for.
But also, how could they possibly pretend that was suicide? How could they physically have done that? Their hands were tied.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. This is the Bush administration era. I mean, they were operating in such a nefarious way at Guantanamo, especially. I mean, that's why Guantanamo existed, was to do all these extra legal things, to exist in the shadows, to exist outside the bounds of the law. So it's, and those were just the first deaths in many more to come. And there hadn't been any deaths up until that point, but then more, quote unquote, suicide started happening. So the interesting thing is,
I think you'd think that they would have, not to, like, just taken the things off of their wrist, like just to make it look remotely realistic. I mean,
again, the internet's not real hot. I mean, it's early. It's just like they feel like there's this is also just so close after 9/11. It's like there is this real feeling that you could get away with anything.
It's total impunity.
And that, Guantanamo, the CIA black sites. I mean, it's just, there is so much feeling that you could do anything and that you should do anything because we're protecting the United States from another terrorist attack. And so that was kind of the attitude at the time. And, part of it was they wanted other detainees to know what happened. And so They didn't want other detainees to think that they had committed suicide. They wanted other detainees to think that they had been murdered, is what I think happened. Of course, none of that's confirmed, but, you know, it is highly suspicious. So the first question is, why did Ron DeSantis, who was kind of a low-ranking officer, get this very important assignment at Guantanamo Bay? I mean, he was a kind of low-ranking guy who had never really done anything significant in his career. So it begs a question, like, was it something about his politics? We know he was a right-winger at the time, pro-Bush administration, neocon type guy. So was he selected for that assignment because they knew? I mean, imagine, like, if you're the commander of, or if you're running Guantanamo Bay and you want to bring in someone to be the human rights lawyer, when you know that you are doing nothing except violating international law and violating human rights, if you're going to bring in a guy, some young Harvard aspirational attorney, human rights attorney, you're going to bring in someone you know is going to play the game and be on your side. Otherwise, it'd be just like career suicide. You're not going to bring in someone that you think might, well, he's going to come here and be horrified by the fact that we're force feeding people with Ensure to the point where they're just defecating themselves and vomiting at the same time. I mean, it's like there's something had to have made them feel that he was a top candidate for this job. So he wraps up his tour in Guantanamo and apparently impressed his superiors and did the job that they expected him to do, because then he goes straight from Guantanamo Bay to Iraq. And again, just like with Guantanamo, what is important, and this is another thing, we knew DeSantis was in Iraq, but we didn't know a lot about what he did. Again, the time, the place, the unit is highly significant. He was there during the troop surge, 2007, the height of the surge. And this was a key moment where for the United States, it was do or die. It was make or break. Either we win the war by any means necessary now, or we've been humiliated on the battlefield, or we're going to be stuck in this endless quagmire. It was the Bush administration's attempt to win through overwhelming force. And the commanders are basically on the understanding we have to win by any means necessary. What is going to get results? He was sent to Fallujah, Iraq, which was like a hotbed of resistance, one of the deadliest places in the country. And he was with Special Operations Forces, so Navy SEALs, Green Berets. And his job there was to do what his job supposedly was at Guantanamo, ensure the humane treatment of detainees and to actually help plan missions, combat missions in accordance with international law for the top commander of all special operations in Fallujah. You know, the types of units that are kind of known for existing in the shadows, not having any legal accountability, and kind of their whole tactic being based around being able to bend the law and especially get around international law. And we don't know exactly what DeSantis did there. We can just know from accounts of other people. And I interviewed a soldier from the infantry who had done these kind of special operations raids and stuff. And all you hear from people who work in that field, who are not like, you know, vet bro, pro-military people, it's that the role of the JAG officer is to keep Americans out of trouble. It's not to say, hey, you're torturing that guy, you can't torture that guy, or hey, you can't kill those civilians. It is to, if something happens that is a violation of international law or local law or U.S. military law, that they make sure it gets covered up, basically. So again, we don't know exactly what he did, but we know that based on what he did at Guantanamo, that he would happily take the job of doing the same thing in Iraq. And you know, the interrogations are happening there too, probably in more of a shady way than Guantanamo, because the interrogations that are happening in the field by special operations are, there's a raid on a house, the guy gets taken from the house, put on a Black Hawk helicopter, flown into the middle of nowhere, and then the interrogation happens there with these CIA and special operations guys, where, you know, they can kill the guy and it's nobody's going to care, nobody's going to know, and or torture them by shooting them in the legs or things like, I mean, the types of things that you actually can't even get away with at Guantanamo are the kind of things that feasibly could be happening in the field there. And so, yeah, I mean, that's, again, we don't know what he did there, but the timing is suspicious. Coming straight from Guantanamo is suspicious. And it's something that I think should be looked into more. I mean, there obviously are witnesses to what he did in Iraq, and there are more witnesses to what he did at Guantanamo. And so what I was trying to do is at least break the story out a little bit. And so hopefully others and regular media could try to dig a little more, because there's clearly something there.
And has anyone followed up, reached out to you or Mansour?
No, there's been so far no media whatsoever except for our world of lefty alternative media. Right. Nobody's picked it up. maybe there are some other journalists working on verifying with other sources and things like that. But, as of now, no. And, there's probably a couple of reasons for that. I mean, there is such a fear of Trump coming back in a Republican primary, and DeSantis is even favored by some liberals and people in the Democratic Party as, he has the same exact politics as Trump, like the exact policy on everything. But the only difference is, Trump can't be trusted because of January 6th, and Ron DeSantis would never do a January 6th, even though he's into the same, voter fraud bullshit. Like, he had people wrongfully arrested for voter fraud in this stunt. And so even though he's the same, because he's this like insider from the Ivy League schools, from the military establishment, connected to the Heritage Foundation, things like that. I mean, he's trusted to be respect the peaceful transition of power. And for that reason, it's likely that this story could be ignored altogether, even though or maybe they'll pull it out when it's DeSantis versus Biden in 2024 or something. I don't know. But I don't know. I mean, does the media even care about torture anymore is a question, I think needs to be answered. Yeah,
that is a good question. I think what you're saying is so true, that he's a presentable politician for these people. He's not like a bumbling idiot the way that Trump is. He's not he does terrible things, and he's is actually, I think it's scarier than Trump because he's not so incompetent. He's not an incompetent administrator in the way that Trump was.
He's a dangerous figure for sure. But also we know that what makes right-wing demagogues, which he of course is trying to become, and obviously there's something suspicious about it. I mean, DeSantis in his whole political career was always kind of a dud, like a boring generic Republican. I mean, was in Congress from 2013 to 2018. Nothing notable, just like a vote like a Marco Rubio type. He just never became known in Congress for anything. Even his first 2 years as governor, being elected in 2018, like his hallmark policy as governor was like saving the Everglades. Like nothing controversial, something that a Democrat would do.
I'm surprised he would do that.
Nobody knew of him. And then all of a sudden in 2020, he has this complete rebrand where it's not just, it's COVID, which is like the wedge issue for MAGA people. Like Trump is proud of the vaccine. A huge amount of his base thinks the vaccine is poison or whatever. And so all of a sudden he comes out as like the Trump, but who's against vaccines, and then starts rolling out all of these reactionary policies to become a hero on the right and doing this culture war bullshit. So there's definitely something going on there behind the scenes, which is probably punishment of Trump for January 6th. Establishment Republicans want to find a replacement and are grooming DeSantis to be the replacement with the same politics, but a trustworthy insider. But the thing that's scary about his military background is a right-wing demagogue like a Trump or someone with this politics is very dangerous, because I mean, we see the violence all the time. I mean, just this horrific killing at the gay nightclub. I mean, this is the result of right-wing demagoguery from people like Tucker Carlson, Donald Trump. I mean, the huge figures with huge followings who whip up all this racist and homophobic anti-trans hysteria. It has real consequences. And when these people are in power, it gets worse, and it's even more dangerous. When you have a right-wing demagogue who not only commands a mass base of violent extremists, but who is a military establishment insider, I mean, that even makes them more dangerous in a lot of ways, because they have a section of the military that is with them in a completely different way. I mean, Trump had that. I mean, he had a MAGA people in the military, and some of them probably assisted him in January 6th and stuff like that. But when you're an officer in the military and you're a right-wing demagogue, I mean, that gives you way more potential to have a sector that is acting with you in a way that would be very scary for this country.
Yeah. Just quick, Brian Frederick writes, Ron DeSantis is a significant threat to civil liberties. Nobody should underestimate the menace he poses to a humane society, which obviously Mike has been speaking to. The last thing I want to ask you about was what your experience in the military, how your experience in the military has kind of shown you the dangerous side of this military loyalty and support that you think could be applied to DeSantis.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess, first of all, like, I have to say that I was to a limited degree involved in interrogations also, like DeSantis. And for me and for friends of mine in the unit, I mean, we were immediately like revolted by it, and then did whatever we could to not do it, and to try to help detainees who we felt were being treated inhumanely. I mean, it's such a human thing. I mean, if you're a good person at heart, I mean, it's the kind of thing that will revolt you. And there's countless Guantanamo and other people like me, but countless people from Guantanamo specifically who were there and were just horrified, and then have now become, outspoken whistleblowers about it. Someone like DeSantis, if you take pleasure in that kind of thing, it says a lot about your character. And so I think that's why this story may have been kind of personal for me, because having been in not even close to the type of torture that DeSantis witnessed, but even just a small fraction of that, I'd like changed the very fiber of my being. It changed who I was as a person. It changed my relationship and views of the military, to my career, my life, everything. It all fell apart, starting with seeing detainees being treated inhumanely. And so that just says a lot about who DeSantis is, that he is proud of it and now is an advocate for making sure Guantanamo Bay never closes. But I think the biggest thing that my military experience taught me is just that it's just all a lie. It's all bullshit. I mean, it's, being in the first year of the Iraq War, it was preventing the United States from an imminent attack from weapons of mass destruction, and providing liberation that Iraqi people so desperately wanted from the United States, and all of that. And it all just falls apart. And anyone who's in the military, it's not everyone, because you have your true believers, but a good portion of the military realizes that they've been bullshit. They've been sold a bill of goods that's not real going in. And then they're just kind of stuck there until their contract is up. And so, it doesn't take joining the military to learn that. I mean, it's obvious to a lot of people that U.S. foreign policy is not based on freedom and democracy and liberation and self-defense, but something very different. But for me, someone who joined at 17 and in peacetime, basically, it was a very different learning experience. But it's one that a lot of people go through. I mean, a lot of people become radicalized in the military, and that's why I'm doing that show Eyes Left, because I know that I can reach other people like I was as a young soldier in the military. I mean, there's so many people who are becoming radicalized in a progressive and left-wing and anti-war way, and it takes certain outlets and communities for them to be able to find community and be able to join the movement and join the struggle. And so even since restarting it, the show a couple of weeks ago, I've just been in touch with so many active duty soldiers who are, think exactly like us, but they're inside the war machine, which I think has a lot of potential for when wars break out.
What do you have to say to people who are considering joining, enlisting for financial reasons, educational opportunities?
I mean, that's a long answer, except just don't do it. And, there's really nothing that makes it worth it. And you're taking a bigger risk than you think. And all the things you think you can get out of it, you'll likely have a harder time achieving those things if you do your 4-year contract and get out. Or you may just, like most people, they realize that they can do nothing with it after their 4 years. And then so they just end up staying in because they feel like, I've already done this many years. I might as well stay until retirement. And, a lot of people don't make it out, or they don't make it out the same, or make it out in one piece, and don't make it out without doing something that was morally compromising to them. That's going to be an issue for them for the rest of their life, and a form of regret for the rest of their life. And even people who join who think, I can join and just kind of benign job and never have to deploy and all that stuff. Like, life in the military just sucks. It sucks. I mean, that's why there's a suicide epidemic in the military. People hate it. And it's all volunteer force on the day that you join, and then it is compulsory. It is not an all volunteer military. It's volunteer when you sign your name on the paper, and then it is an 8-year mandatory commitment. You are not allowed to leave. And so that is overwhelming for a lot of people. And, military life is just kind of bad. And that's why there's a huge recruitment crisis right now. I mean, huge shortfalls in recruiting because people are aware of that. And then a whole new rebranding that right now the Army is doing is to not focus on all the stuff the Marine does of like, oh, you can be a badass, you can shoot guns, you can fly in a fucking helicopter, all that stuff. It's all you can go on vacations and you can fucking play pool at the club with people who have different accents. And it's all about how you can have fun, a fun life. There's actually one ad, it's about, will help you complete your bucket list in the Army, meaning that you can go ziplining and all this stuff like recreational. They're back to fun travel adventure, which they did before the Vietnam War, of you can have this great recreational fun life and obscuring what life is really like in the military. So yeah, don't fall for it.
Well, Mike, thank you so much. Anything else you want to make sure people know about? Anything else you want to plug, or because you do such important work?
Yeah, most of the stuff I do is at Empire Files. So check out Empire Files on YouTube and social media. And yeah, the Eyes Left podcast. We've done a lot of back episodes that are timeless that people should check out. Interviews with other soldiers like me. I'm not the only one who had my experience and talks like this. So there's lots of other great people we try to highlight. And yeah, we're on social media at Eyes Left Pod.
Great. And would love to, of course, have you back again, because I always love talking to you and learn a lot from you. And people are very inspired by you.
Anytime, Katie. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Cool.
Have a great night, Mike. Bye. All right, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. I can't do a call-in tonight, but I will do a call-in tomorrow. Put in the comments when you want me to do a call-in. I'll do a little pre-Thanksgiving call-in. What else? Yes, thank you so much for tuning in. Please rate and review the podcast. Please like this stream right now if you haven't already. Please subscribe. Also, you, of course, can support the show at patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. Again, that's patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. There's a lot of interesting takes in the chats that I would address. I don't have time to now, but I think people need to, some of you are in good faith kind of grappling with the sex work question. Some of you are just really angry and have to deal with that somehow. And maybe Tami and Jay can come back on and talk to you, but decriminalize. That's the obvious answer. And wishing everyone a happy problematic holiday, which happens on Thursdays. When is the next live in-person show? I'm not sure, but we'll do it again because it was great to do it. That's about it. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Phantom Fanta. Brad, am I missing anything? No, okay. All right. Bye, everyone. And I'll tweet out when I'm doing the call-in. I'll add it to the description once I've decided, but it'll be sometime Wednesday. Okay? Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for listening to The Katie Halper Show. See you next week.
Okay, I'm down.